The first time I met him, I could tell this bear wasn't normal. Not just because he had somehow figured out how to open his own enclosure at the small wildlife rehabilitation center on the edge of Pine Ridge, Montana, but because when I leaned over the railing and asked, "Do you want to go home with me?" he tilted his head, blinked once, and gave the smallest, slowest nod I'd ever seen from a wild animal. That was my first clue that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. I had gone to the center with my friend Aaron, who volunteered there on weekends. My plan was to drop off a few bags of donated feed and some blankets, not to pick up a new housemate. But the moment I saw this massive, thick-furred trickster with deep amber eyes, I was hooked. He didn't pace like the others. He sat in the middle of his pen, forepaws planted neatly, watching me like I was the one on display. "That's the one that keeps unlocking his gate," Aaron whispered, shaking his head. "Twice this week, we had to install a new latch." Later, I learned his backstory was just as unusual as his behavior. He'd been found alone near an abandoned logging camp deep in the mountains, scavenging for scraps from derelict cabins. No one knew how long he'd been surviving like that, but he was in remarkable condition. The volunteers discovered quickly that he could mimic sounds. The creak of a wheelbarrow, the snap of a latch, even the muffled click of a walkie-talkie button. I signed the paperwork that same afternoon. The staff didn't try to talk me out of it, they just patted me on the back and wished me luck. The first day home, he inspected my cabin like he'd been hired to appraise it. He moved from room to room, sniffing every corner, nudging open 2 cupboards, and finally lumbering to the back deck, where he sat for a solid minute, staring at the tree line as if weighing the quality of the view. When I put out a wide bowl of water for him, he dipped a paw in, swirled it around, and then, still blows my mind, pushed the bowl across the floor to the sink. He turned his head to look at me until I turned on the tap. Apparently, only running water would do. That night, I caught him in the pantry, carefully prying the lid off my cookie tin. I clapped my hands and said, "No." He froze, blinked, and without breaking eye contact, set the lid down softly before walking away with an air of innocence that fooled no one. I thought maybe his intelligence would make him easy to train. The opposite happened. You don't train a 200 IQ bear, you negotiate. Every instruction was treated like a suggestion he could accept or reject. One morning I told him, "Go to your bed," before leaving for work. He padded halfway toward it, looked back at me, then detoured to grab the TV remote from the coffee table. When I came home, the television was on a documentary about grizzlies. He was sprawled in front of the screen, chin on his paws, watching like a student. He had a taste for surprises. One September afternoon, I opened the hall closet to get my jacket and found tinsel scattered across the floor. My bear was sitting in the middle of it like a king on a throne, a string of lights wrapped loosely around his thick neck. He had pulled out the Christmas decorations and arranged them in a perfect semicircle. Food quickly became a daily negotiation. He learned exactly where I kept the treats and would test my resolve with quiet persistence. If I refused, he would lumber away slowly, only to reappear minutes later with something in his mouth. My hat, a large stick, once even my missing boot, as if offering a trade. I was never lonely with him around. If I sat at the table with my head down, thinking about the breakup I'd gone through a few months earlier, he would walk over and set one massive paw gently on my shoulder, his deep breath rumbling through the space between us. It was grounding, comforting, absurd, and perfect all at once. His sense of humor was sharp. If I was on a call, he would wait for the exact moment to knock something over. Not enough to break it, just enough to make noise. Once, during a video chat, he stood on his hind legs behind me and leaned his head into the camera frame, wearing an unmistakably smug expression. The most legendary moment came when I had to take him to the vet. I set the transport crate on the floor and said, "Let's go." He stepped inside without hesitation. I thought, finally, an easy win. But when I reached for the latch, he backed out, turned, and slid the latch closed from the outside. Then he sat down and stared at me as if to say, "Your move." Pine Ridge winters can be brutal. The first heavy snow fell in late November. I woke to find him sitting at the window, watching the flakes with unwavering focus. When I opened the back door, He stepped out like a monarch surveying his realm, then suddenly dropped to his side and rolled in the snow, legs kicking like an oversized cub. He became a part of my life in ways I hadn't expected. If I stayed up late watching movies, he would sit beside me until the credits rolled, his heavy presence a warm, grounding weight in the quiet room. Sometimes, halfway through a scene, I'd feel the slow, deliberate press of his head against my arm, as though to check if I was still paying attention to both him and the story. When the credits finally rolled, he would rise, stretch in that slow, rolling way only a bear can, and nudge my knee as if to say, "Time for bed." The nudge was never hard, but it carried the kind of certainty that made it feel less like a suggestion and more like an established nightly ritual. In the mornings, he would follow me into the kitchen, not for food, but to watch the coffee maker, fascinated by the hiss and gurgle. His head would tilt, his ears twitching with every burble and drip, and, if I leaned down to whisper to him, he'd look back at me as though I'd just told him a secret worth keeping. Friends came over just to see him, more than to see me. Aaron swears the bear once winked at him, a slow, deliberate blink with just enough head tilt to seem like a joke shared between old friends. Another buddy brought a laser pointer one afternoon, expecting chaos and a frantic chase. Instead, my bear tracked the red dot for all of 2 seconds before walking straight to the light's source, planting a massive paw over the pointer and holding it there until it was handed over. He then carried it to the corner of the room, set it down carefully, and looked back at us with what could only be described as quiet triumph. Moments like that made people realize he wasn't just an animal in the house. He was a personality, a presence, someone with preferences and boundaries, and a surprisingly sharp sense of humor. He taught me patience, not the shallow kind that comes from waiting in line or counting down minutes on a clock, but the deep, unhurried kind that grows when you accept someone else's pace as valid. If he wanted to stop halfway down the trail to sniff the air for 10 minutes, I learned to stop too, feeling the wind on my own face until he was ready to move on. He taught me awareness, a different kind of attention to detail, because with him, the tiniest twitch of an ear or shift in weight could mean the difference between a peaceful evening and a pantry raid. I started noticing more in life, shadows moving across the yard at dusk, the exact moment the air cooled before rain, the subtle change in the way his breathing sounded when he was truly relaxed. Living with him didn't just change my routines. It sharpened my senses, tuned me into a slower, richer rhythm of days I never knew I needed. Sometimes I caught myself watching him the way he had watched me that first day, head tilted, eyes fixed, as if I were a puzzle worth solving. I often wondered if he knew he had been rescued, if he understood that the lonely days at the camp were gone forever, or did he think this was just another stop on a long, uncertain road? There were evenings I found him sitting silently on the porch, eyes scanning the tree line. His ears would flick at faint rustles, his body coiled like he was weighing the pull of the wild against the warmth of the life we had built. We had found each other at exactly the right time. I had been stumbling through my own quiet storms, needing something to pull me out of my head. He needed someone patient enough to live with the unpredictable orbit of a genius. And genius really was the right word. He didn't just solve problems, he created them. Every latch was a challenge. Every closed container was a puzzle he had to open, and once he succeeded, he would look at me like he expected applause. There were days when I swore he woke up already scheming, his mind ticking faster than my coffee pot could drip. I'd catch him staring at a locked cupboard with the same intensity a scientist might use to stare at a blackboard full of equations. Then, in a blur of fur and stubbornness, he'd have the thing open, paws deep inside, rummaging like he'd just discovered a portal to another world. He had no concept of boundaries, only opportunities. If I left a window cracked, he'd be halfway out of it, just to see if the latch worked differently from the inside. If I placed my tools in neat rows, he'd rearrange them by some system known only to him, and then watch my confusion with a little huff that I'm fairly certain was laughter. For all the chaos, there was a rhythm to life with him. Bursts of activity followed by stretches of quiet, when he would curl up beside me, his breathing slow and steady, his warmth sinking into my bones. It was in those moments, when the world narrowed to his steady heartbeat and the weight of his head against my side, that the storms in my own mind softened. We didn't need words. His quiet presence was its own kind of language, one that said, "You're here, I'm here, and for now, that's enough." Life with a 200 IQ bear is never dull. It's chaotic, hilarious, sometimes exhausting, mornings starting with missing keys, because apparently my coat pocket was just another container to be inspected. Afternoons would be interrupted by mysterious projects dragged into the living room, pieces of branches, old buckets, once even my lawn chair, dismantled and reassembled into something that might have been a fort, or might have been a work of abstract art. Nights were punctuated by the heavy thump of him climbing onto furniture he knew was off limits, pretending, if bears can pretend, that maybe I wouldn't notice 200 pounds of fur settling into my armchair. And yet, even at his most exasperating, I couldn't help but be amazed. There was a spark in him that refused to dim, and endless curiosity that mirrored my own on the better days. I started to find joy in the unpredictability, to see my own life less as a list of plans, and more as a series of puzzles waiting to be explored. He taught me that not every locked door needs to stay closed, that sometimes it's worth knocking something over just to see how it's put together. And in the quiet hours, when the moonlight slanted across the floor and he'd rest his head on my knee, I'd realize that the laughter he brought me, the patience he taught me, and the companionship he gave me were worth every moment of chaos. I rescued him, sure, but in more ways than I can count, he rescued me right back.